Well, look at all this. Sure is good to see everybody tonight. Haven't seen some of you for a couple weeks. Some of us have been out and about, trying to get the last of the summer's fun in and maybe take little vacations. I know I did. As we wind down the summer, it's good to see everybody around this fire. It's getting chillier and this fire feels nicer all the time, doesn't it? Tonight, we're going to read you some more Max Brand from The Seventh Man, Book 3 of it. We're at Chapter 13 already. So we'll read a few tonight. Get settled in and find yourself a place next to a friend or a new friend, and let's get started. Chapter 13, Equal Payment. Well, they knew what it meant. Even Joan had heard the cry of the lone wolf hunting in the lean time of winter. And of all things sad, all things lonely, all things demonical, the howl of a wolf stands alone. Lee Haines reached for his gun. Little Joan stood up silent on the hearth, but Kate and Buck Daniels sat listening with a sort of hungry terror as the cry sobbed away to quiet. Then, out of the mountains in the night came an answer so thin, so eerie, one might have said it was the voice of the mountains and the white stars grown audible. It stole on the ear as the pulse of a heart comes to the consciousness. Truly, it was an answer to the cry of the wolf dog, for in the slender compass it carried the same wail, the same unearthly quality, with this great difference, that a thrilling happiness went through it, as if someone walked through the mountains and rejoiced in the unknown terrors. A sob formed in the throat of Kate, and the wolf turned its head and looked at her, and the yellow of things that sees in the night swam in its eyes. Lee Haines struck the arm of Buck Daniels. "Buck, let's get clear of this. Let's start. He's coming." At the whisper, Buck turned a livid face. One could see him gather his strength. "I stick," he said with difficulty, as though his lips were numb. "She'll need me now." Lee Haines stood in a moment's indecision, but then settled back in his chair and gripped his hands together. They both sat watching the door as if the darkness were a magnet of inescapable horror. Only Joan, of all in that room, showed no fear after that first moment. Her face was blanched indeed, but she tilted it up now, smiling. She stole towards the door, but Kate caught that child and gathered her close with strangling force. Joan made no attempt to escape. "Shh," she cautioned and raised a plump little forefinger. "Munner, don't you hear? Don't you like it?" As if a sound had turned a corner, it broke all at once clearly above them in a rain of music. A man's whistling. It went out. It flooded about them like beautiful cold light. Once again it stopped. Now they sensed rather than heard a light, rapid, padding step that approached the cabin. Dan Barry stood in the door, and in that shadowy place his eyes seemed luminous. He no longer whistled, but a spirit went from him which carried the same sense of the untamed, the wild happiness, which died out with his smile as he looked around the room. The brim of his hat curved up. His neckerchief seemed to flutter a little, and that wolf dog reached the threshold in the same instant and stood looking steadily up into the face of his master. "Daddy Dan!" cried Joan. She had slipped from the neverless arms of Kate and now ran towards her father, but here she faltered. There she stopped, with her arms slowly flailing back to her sides. He did not seem to see her, but he looked past her, far beyond everyone in the room, as he walked to the wall, took down a bridle that hung on a peg. Kate laid her hands on the arms of the chair, but after the first effort to rise, her strength failed. "Dan," she said. It was only a whisper, a heart-stopping sound. "Dan," her voice rang. Then her arms gathered to her, blindly, Joan, who had shrunk back. "What happened?" "Molly died." "Died?" "They broke her leg." "The posse?" "With a long shot." "What are you going to do?" "Get Satan, go for a ride." Where? He looked about him troubled and then frowned. I don't know. Out yonder. He waved his arm. Black Bart followed the turn of the master's body and, switching around in front, continued to stare up into Dan's face. You're going back after the posse? No, I'm done with them. What do you mean? They paid for Gray Molly. You shot one of their horses? A man. God help us. The life came to her. She sprang up and ran between him and the door. You shan't go, if you love me. She was only inches from Black Bart, and that big animal showed his teeth in silent hate. Kate, I'm going. Don't stand in the door. Joan, slipping around Bart, stood clinging to the skirts of her mother and watched the face of Dan, fascinated, silent. Tell me where you're going. Tell me when you're coming back. Dan, for pity. Loud as a trumpet, a horse neighed from the corral. Dan had stood with an uncertain face, but now he smiled. Do you hear? I got to go. I heard Satan whinny, but what does that mean? How does that make you go? Somewhere, he murmured. Something's happening. I felt it on the wind when I was coming up the pass. If you... Oh, Dan, you're breaking my heart. Stand out of the door. Wait till the morning. Don't you see I can't wait? 1 hour, 10 minutes. Buck, Lee Haines. She could not finish, but Buck Daniels stepped closer, trying to make a smile grow on his ashen face. Another minute, Dan, and I'll tell a man you've forgotten me. Barry pivoted suddenly as though uneasy at finding something behind him, and Daniels winced. Hello, Buck. Didn't see you was here. Lee Haines? Lee, this is fine. He passed from one to the other, and his handshake was only the elusive passage of his fingers through their palms. Haines shrugged his shoulders to get rid of a weight that clung to him. A touch of color come back to his face. Look here, Dan. If you're afraid that gang may trail you here and start raising the devil, how many are there? 5. I'm as good with a gun as I ever was in the old days, and so's Buck. Partner, let's make the showdown together. You stick here with Kate and Joan, and Buck and I will help you hold the fort. Don't look at me like that. I mean it. Do you think I've forgotten what you did for me that night in Elkhead? Not in 1,000 years, Dan. I'd rather make my last play here than any other place in the world. Let 'em come. We'll salt them down and plant 'em where they don't grow. As he talked, the pallor quite left him, and the fighting fire blazed in his eyes. He stood lion-like, his feet spread apart as if to meet a shock, his tawny head thrown back, and there was about him a hair-trigger sensitiveness, in spite of his bulk, a nervousness of hand and coldness of glance which characterizes the gunfighter. Buck Daniels stepped closer without a word, but one felt that he also had walked into the alliance. As Barry watched them, the yellow which swirled in his eyes flickered away for a moment. Why, gents, he murmured, they ain't any call for trouble. The posse? What's that got to do with me? Our accounts are all squared up. The two stared dumbly. They killed Gray Molly. I killed one of them. A horse? For a man? Repeated Lee Haines, breathing hard. A life for a life, said Dan simply. They got no call for complaining. Glances of wonder, glances of meaning flashed back and forth from Haines to Buck. Well then, said the latter as he took in Kate with a caution from the corner of his eye, if that's the case, then let's sit down and chin for a minute. Dan stood with his head bowed a little, frowning. 2 forces pulled him, and Kate leaned against the wall, off in the shadow, with her eyes closed, waiting through the crisis. I'd like to stay and chin with you, Buck, but I got to be off. Out there, in the night. Something may happen before morning. Black Bart licked the hand of the master and whined. Easy, boy, we're starting. But the night's just beginning, said Buck Daniels genially. You got a world of time before you, and with Satan to fall back on, you don't have to count your minutes. Pull up a chair beside me, Dan, and the latter shook his head. Decided. Buck, I can't do it. Just to sit here. He looked about him. Makes me feel sort of choked. Them walls are as close as a coffin. He was already turning. Kate straightened in the shadow, desperate. As a matter of fact, Dan, said Lee Haines suddenly, we need your help badly. Help? The heart of Kate stood in her eyes as she looked up at Lee Haines. Sit down a minute, Dan, and I'll tell you about it. Barry slipped into a chair which he had pulled to one side, so that the back of it was towards the wall, and everyone in the room was before him. Chapter 14, Suspense. The help which Lee Haines wanted, it turned out, was a guidance across a difficult stretch of country which he and Buck Daniels wanted to prospect. And while he talked, Barry listened uneasily. It was constitutionally impossible for him to say no when a favor was asked of him, and Haines counted heavily on that characteristic. In the meantime, Black Bart lay on the hearth with his wistful eye turned steadily up to the master, and Buck Daniels went to Kate on the farther side of the room. She sat quivering, alternately crushing and soothing Joan with the strength of her caress. Buck drew a chair close with his back half towards the fire. Turn around a little, Kate, he cautioned. Don't let Dan see your face. She obeyed him automatically. Is there a hope, Buck? What have I done to deserve this? I don't want to live. I want to die. I want to die. Steady, steady, he cut in, and his face was working. If you keep on like this, you'll bust down in a minute or two. And you know what tears do to Dan. He'll be out of this house like a scared coyote. Brace up. She struggled and won a partial control. I'm fighting hard, Buck. We'll fight harder still. You ought to know him better than I do. When he's like this, it drives him wild to have other folks thinking about him. He looked over to Dan. In spite of the bowed head of the latter as he listened to Haines yarning, he gave an impression of electric awareness to all that was around him. Talk soft, whispered Buck. Maybe he knows we're talking about him. He raised his voice out of the whisper, breaking in on a sentence about Joan, as if this were the tenor of their talk. Then he lowered his tone again. Think quick. Talk soft. Do you want Dan kept here? For God's sake, yes. Suppose the posse gets him here. We mustn't dodge the law. Now, they were gauging their voices with the closest precision. Talking like this so close to Barry was like dancing among flasks of nitroglycerin. Once, and only once, Lee Haines cast a desperate eye across to them, begging them to come to his rescue. Then he went back to his talk with Dan, raising his voice to shelter the conference of the other two. If they come, he'll fight. No, he isn't at the fighting pitch yet, I know. If you're wrong, there'll be dead men here. He sees no difference between the death of a horse and the death of a man. He feels that the law has no score against him. He'll go quietly, and we'll find ways of fighting the law. Yes, but it needs money. I've got a stake. Oh, God bless you, Buck. Take my advice. What? Let him go now. She glanced at him wildly. Kate, he gone already. No. I say he's gone. Look at his eyes. I don't care. The yaller is coming up to him. He's wild again. She shook her head in mute agony. Buck Daniels groaned softly. Then there's going to be a small-sized hell starting around this cabin before morning. He got up and went slowly back towards the fire. Lee Haines was talking steadily, leisurely, going round and round his subject again and again, and Barry listened with bowed head, but his eyes were fixed upon those of the wolf dog at his feet. When he grew restless, Haines chained him to that chair with some direct question, yet it was a hard game to play. All this time the posse might be gathering round the cabin, and the forehead of Haines whitened and glistened with sweat. His voice was the only living thing in the cabin. After a time, sketching his imaginary plans for the benefit of Barry, his voice and the wistful eyes of Joan, which kept steadily on Danny Dan. Something has come between them and lifted the barrier which she could not understand, and with all her aching child's heart, she wondered at it. For the second time that evening, the wolf stood up on the hearth, but he was not yet on his feet before Dan was out of his chair and standing close to the wall where the shadows swallowed him up. Lee Haines sat with his lips frozen on the next unspoken word. Two shadows whose feet made no sound. Black Bart and Dan glided to the door and peered into the night. Then Barry went back, step by step, until his back was once more to the wall. Not until that instant did the others hear. It was a step which approached behind the house, a loud rap at the back door. It was the very loudness of the knock which made Kate draw a breath of relief. If it had been a stealthy tap, she would have screamed. Who had rapped did not wait for an answer. They heard the door creak open and the sound of a heavy man's step. "It's Vic," said Dan quietly. Then the door opened which led into the kitchen, and the tall form of Gregg entered, and he paused there. "Here I am again, ma'am." "Good evening," she answered faintly. He cleared his throat, embarrassed. "Darned if I didn't play a full game today. Hello, Dan." The other nodded. "Rode in a plumb circle and come back where I started." He laughed, and the laughter broke off a little shortly. He stepped to the wall and hung up his bridle on its peg, which is the immemorial manner of asking hospitality in the mountain desert. "Hope I ain't putting you out, Kate. I see you got company." She started, recalled from her thoughts. "Excuse me, Vic. Vic Gregg, Buck Daniels, Lee Haines." They shook hands, and Vic detained Haines a moment. "Seems to me I've heard of you, Haines." "Mebbe." Gregg looked at the big man narrowly and then swung back towards Dan. He knew many things now. Lee Haines, yeah, that was his name, one of the crew who followed Jim Silent. And Dan Barry? What a fool he had been not to remember. It was Dan Barry who had gone on the trail of Silent's gang and hounded it to death. Lee Haines alone had been spared. Yes, half a dozen years before the mountain folk had heard that story, a wild and impossible one. It fitted in with what Pete Glass had told him of the shooting of Harry Fisher. It explained a great deal which had mystified him since he first met Barry. It made the thing he had come to do at once easier and harder. "I suppose Molly showed a clean pair of heels to the whole lot of 'em," he said to Dan. "She's dead." "Dead?" His astonishment was well enough affected. "God a'mighty, Dan, not Grey Molly, my hoss?" "Dead. I shot her." Vic gasped. "You?" "They busted her leg. I put her out of pain." Gregg dropped into a chair. It was not altogether an affection, not altogether a piece of skillful acting now, for though the sheriff had told him all that happened, he had not had a chance to feel the truth. But now it swept over him. All her tricks, all her deviltry, all that long companionship. His head bowed. No smiles touched the face of the others in the room, but a reverent silence fell on the room. Then that figure among the shadows moved out, stepped to the side of Vic, and a light hand rested on his shoulders. The other looked up, haggard. "She's gone, partner," Dan said gently, "but she's paid for." "Paid for? Dan, there ain't no money could pay me back for Grey Molly. I know. Not that way. But there was a life given for a life." "Eh?" "One man died for Molly." As that meaning came home to Gregg, he blinked. And then, looking up, he found a change in the eyes of Barry, for they seemed to be lighted from within coldly, and his glance went down to the very bottom of Vic's soul, probing. It was only an instant, a thing in which Gregg could not make sure, and then Dan slipped back into this place among the shadows by the wall. But a chill sense of guilt, a premonition of danger stayed in Gregg. The palms of his hands grew moist. Chapter 15. 7 for 1. Dangerous men were no novelty for Greg. He'd lived with them, worked with them, as hard-fisted himself as any, and as ready for trouble. But the man of the mountain desert has a peculiar dread for the practiced, known gunfighter. In the days of the rapier, when the art of fence grew so complicated that half a life was needed for its mastery, men would as soon commit suicide as ruffle it with an assured duelist. And the man of the mountain desert has a similar respect for those who are born, it might be said, gun in hand. There was ample reason for the pricklings in his scalp, Vic felt, for here he sat on an errand of consummate danger with 3 of these deadly fighters. 2 of them he knew by name and repute, however dimly, and as for Buck Daniels, unless all signs failed, the dark, sharp-eyed fellow was hardly less grim than the others. Vic gauged the 3 one by one. Daniels might be dreaded for an outburst of wild temper, and in that moment he could be as terrible as any. Lee Haines could fight coolly, his blue eyes never clouded by passion, for that was his repute as a right-hand man of Jim Silent, in the days when Jim had been a terrible, half-legendary figure. One felt that same quiet strength as that tawny-haired man talked to Barry now. His voice was a smooth, deep current. But as for Barry himself, Greg could not compute the facts which entered into this man. By all outward, seemingly that slender, half-timid figure was not a tithe of the force which either of the others represented. But out of the past, Greg's memory gathered more and more details, clear and clearer, of the wolf dog, the black stallion, and the whistling man who tracked down Silent. Whistlin Dan Barry. That was what they called him, sometimes. Nothing was definite in the minds of Greg. The stories consisted of patched details, heard here and there a third or fourth hand. But he remembered one epic incident in which Barry had ridden, so rumor had told, into the very heart of Elkhead, taken from the jail this very man, this Lee Haines, and carried him through the cordon of every armed man in Elkhead. And there was another picture, dimmer still, which an eyewitness had painted, of how, at an appointed hour, Barry met Jim Silent and killed him. Out of these thoughts he glanced again at the man in the shadow, half expecting to find his host swollen to giant size. Instead, he found that same meager form, the same old suggestion of youth which would not age, the same pale hands of almost feminine litheness. Lee Haines talked on about a porphyritic dike somewhere to the north, alleged to be found in the space of 10,000 square miles, a list of vague clues, an appeal for Barry to help them find it, and Barry was held listening, though ever seemingly to drift, or about to drift, towards that door. Black Bart lay facing his master, and his snaky head followed every movement. Kate sat where the firelight barely touched on her. In her arms she held Joan, whose face and great bright eyes were turned towards Daddy Dan. All things in the room centered on the place where the man sat by the wall, and the sense of something impending swept over Greg. Then a wild fear. Did they know the danger outside? He must make conversation. He turned to Kate, but at that same moment, the voice of Buck Daniels beside him, close. "I know how you feel, old man. I remember an old bay hoss of mine, a Morgan hoss, and when he died I grieved for near onto a year mostly. He wasn't much of a hoss to look at, too long coupled, you'd say, but his legs was short. But he got about like a coyote, and when he sat down on a rope you couldn't budge him with a team of Percherons. That's how good he was. When he was a 4-year-old, I was cutting out yearlings with him, and how—" The loud, cheerful tone fell away in a confidential murmur. Daniels leaned closer with a smile of prospective humor, but the words which came to Greg were, "Partner, if I was you, I'd get up and and I wouldn't stop till I put a hell of a long ways between me and this cabin." It spoke well of Vic's nerve that no start betrayed him. He bowed his head a little, as though to catch the trend of the jolly story better, nodding. "What's wrong?" he muttered back. Barry's watching you out of the shadow. Then, you fool, don't look. But there was method in Vic's raising his head. He threw it back and broke into laughter. But while he laughed, he searched the shadow by the wall where Dan sat, and he felt glimmering eyes fixed steadily upon him. He dropped his head again as if to hear more. What's it mean, Daniels? You ought to know. I don't. But he don't mean you no good. He's looking at you too steady. If I was you, through the whisper of Buck, through the loud, steady talk of Lee Haines, cut the voice of Barry. Vic. The latter looked up and found that Barry was standing just within the glow of the hearthlight, and something about him made Greg's heart shrink. Vic, how much did they pay you? He tried to answer, and he would have given 10 years of life to have his voice under control for just this instant. But his tongue froze. He knew that everyone had turned towards him, and he tried to smile. He looked unconcerned. But in spite of himself, his eyes were wide, fixed, and he felt that they could stare into the bottom of his soul and see the guilt. How much? Then his voice came, but he could have groaned when he heard its crazily shaken, shrill sound. What do you mean, Dan? The other smiled, and Greg added hastily, If you want me to be moving along, Dan, of course you're the doctor. How much did they pay? Repeated that quiet, inexorable voice. He could have stood that, even without much fear. But no matter how terrible the man might be in action, his hands were tied in his own house. But now Kate spoke. Vic, what have you done? Then it came in a flood. Hot shame rolled through him, and the words burst out. I'm a yaller hound dog, a sneaking no-good cur, Dan, you're right. I've sold you. They're out there, all of 'em, waiting in the rocks. For God's sake, take my gun and pump me full of lead. He threw his arms out clear of his holster and turned that Barry might draw his revolver. Vaguely, he knew that Haines and Buck had drawn swiftly close to him from either side. Vaguely, he heard the cry of Kate. But all that he clearly understood was the merciless, unmoved face of Barry. It was a pretense. With all his being, he wanted to die. But when Barry made no move to strike, he turned desperately to the others. Do the job for him. He saved my life, and then I used it to sell him. Daniels, Haines, I got no use for living. Vic, he said, take this and march to your friends outside, and when you get through them, you plant a 45 slug in your own dirty heart and then rot. Haines held out his gun with a gesture of contempt. But Kate slipped in front of him, white with anguish. It was the girl you told me about, Vic, she said. You did it to get back to her? He dropped his head. Dan, let him go. I got no thought of using him. Why not? Cried Vic suddenly. I'll do the way Haines said, or else let me stay here and fight him off with you, Dan. For God's sake, give me one chance to make good. It was like talking to a face of stone. The door's open for you and waiting. One thing before you go. That's the same gang you told me about before. Ronicky Joe, Harry Fisher, Gus Reeve, Matt Henshaw, Silver Waldron, and Pete Glass. Harry Fisher's dead, Dan. If you'll give me one fighting chance to play square now. Tell him that I know him. Tell him one more thing. I thought Gray Molly was worth only one man, but I was wrong. They've done me dirt and played crooked. They come hunting me with a decoy. Now you tell him from me that Gray Molly is worth 7 men, and she's going to be paid for in full. He stepped to the wall and took down the bridle which Vic had hung there. I guess you'll be needing this. It ended all talk. It even seemed to Greg that as soon as he received the bridle from the hand of Barry, the truce ended with a sudden period and war began. He turned slowly away. Well now, I guess we got some stuff coming down. Sounds like a shooting war. Folks, looks like some excitement next time we talk about this story. You know, I'm glad y'all made it, and I'm glad y'all come around to listen to our stories, enjoy our companionship. I sure enjoy it. I'd sure like to hear some stories from y'all. I really want to tell some of the stories that you have. So send them on in to us and let us know in the comments. We'll be glad to talk about it here around the campfire. And maybe that's your story we're going to tell next week. And until that time, y'all have a good time. Be careful. Enjoy yourselves, though. We're supposed to, you know. Good night. This is Clay Steele.